I thought I would do something a little different with today's podcast. It is a lecture that I did for the Nevada Museum of Art. They had a recent large Maynard Dixon exhibit that's now down, but there is a great book that goes with it on Dixon's Nevada pieces. So this is an hour-long lecture on just Maynard Dixon and the West, the whole story from when he was born till when he dies. I hope you enjoy this lecture that I gave on Maynard Dixon. I wish I could see the show. It sounds fantastic. But what I'm going to talk to you today about is a little different. Instead of talking about Nevada, because you've had a lot of talks about that, what I want to do is really focus in on Dixon and the American West and the whole arc. And that arc is very interesting because it starts from the Gilded Age. It goes to the Spanish-American War, through the earthquake of 1906, and then he goes through the First World War and the Great Pandemic, followed by the Depression, World War II, and then all the way to the nuclear age. Now imagine that. He's going to live through the entire arc of what we think of as the 20th century. And you'll see some very interesting things that he accomplishes, and you'll find out, hopefully, about his life as well as the things he had to suffer with, and he had a lot. So when you think about Dixon, he is born before the Battle of Little Bighorn, which is on June 25th of 1876, where the entire 7th Cavalry is going to be wiped out by Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho. And the Buffalo are completely still alive and running. So he's really in the Old West at this point. He's in the Gilded Age, right? So Mark Twain, which he did this drawing of, Twain is the man who wrote the book with Charles Dudley Warner on the Gilded Age. And that's the point. And they did that in 1873. So this is where Dixon begins his life. We don't have electricity, right? We really have not set up power plants. Thomas Edison's going to set up the first power plant, and that's going to be down in the southern part of Manhattan in the Pearl District. And there's going to be 400 lights and 90 customers. This is critically important for young Dixon, who's starting his career right about this time. He's already starting to think about being an artist. He's drawing from things from life as well as things from magazines. He starts this at about age 8. Now, if you look at what he would have seen at that time, he would have seen this, the surrender of Geronimo. And that was September 4th at Skeleton Canyon, and that was to General Miles. And Dixon would have been very aware of these kind of things because he was already interested in Indians and cowboys in the West, like a lot of kids were. But Dixon, again, is frail, has bad asthma, and he really can't get out and do other things. So he uses that creative juice that he has, not only for doing drawings, but for writing. Now, the next thing that Dixon would have seen, and he definitely would have been very aware of this, was December 29th of 1890. And this is what it really looked like. This was Wounded Knee. We had over 250 of the Lakota Sioux, which were of spotted elk's tribe, also known as Bigfoot, were shot down by the 7th Cavalry. And they're going to get 19 medals of honor for that battle. Now, the realities are that, but the realities of what the West sees is this. Frederick Remington's drawing, Harper Weekly. This is done on Dixon's birthday, January 24th of 1891. That's when he puts this out, and Dixon's very aware of this. And how do we know that? Well, Dixon's going to write to Frederick Remington. Now, you can imagine that this 16-year-old boy is going to contact the most important illustrator of the day, Frederick Remington. And he's going to send him his drawings. And this is one of his drawings that he sends, which is his first portrait from life. And if you look at that, you can see down in the bottom right a little signature. And that is a hallmark that Dixon is trying to figure out who he is, right? Young artists always do this. They're trying to figure out what their signature is. For Dixon, this is one of the earliest signatures we'll see. The other thing on this, if you look, you'll see some writing up above, which I'm going to talk about. So he writes to Remington, and Remington says to Dixon, he goes, "You're better at your age than I was. Draw, draw, draw. It's better if you can get some education. I didn't, but it's better if you can. You may not make a big life as an artist, but you might be happy. And always go from nature, draw from nature. And Dixon's going to take it very seriously to heart for his entire life. Now, if you look at that signature up above, that says, this is a good study. That's in Frederick Remington's hand. And Dixon hangs on to this. He will follow Remington's thought of what it is to be an artist for a very long time. So Dixon goes, okay, Remington says it's good if I can get an education. So he goes to the California School of Design, and that's in 1892. Now, if you look at this image, what you're going to see is first the guy that's doing his head, who's scratching it, that's Arthur Matthews, and that's Dixon's teacher. Now, Dixon's going to say, he scared me to death, right? Again, Dixon's frail, he has asthma, and he's in this class where they're going to be really structured lectures and talks from a man who's trained in Europe. And Dixon really can't handle it. And in this drawing, if you look to the far left, you'll see that there is a little guy in a hat. That's Jimmy Swinnerton. And both Swinnerton and Arthur Matthews are going to be in the Bohemian Club, as is Dixon. And Dixon's there from 1902 to 1930. Now, there's a few things to point out here. One, if you look at the drawing itself, Dixon shows himself as like this spider guy, right, with these big legs, and but look at his left hand. He's a southpaw. So when he draws, it's 10-4, right? So this is a very good way to know if it's a real Dixon, if it's done by a left-handed person, because if it's a right-handed person, it's going to be the other way. Now, occasionally you'll see things like that on Dixon's the other way if he turned the paper, but if you want to know a fake, if it's a right-handed drawing, it's not probably a Dixon. So Dixon doesn't stay in the school but 3 months, and he leaves. And he's 18 by the time he goes, 1893. And what happens? Well, he immediately gets a job at Overland Monthly to do an illustration. And the world actually is kind of exploding. And as you can see from this, it says panic. Well, there was a huge panic because you had a Great Depression that was happening. You had 500 banks go insolvent. You have 15,000 businesses that go kapunk. And you have a quarter of the entire railroad going into receivership. So it's a very dark time for America. In fact, they're going to blame this on Cleveland, Grover Cleveland, and it's going to lead to McKinley getting the presidency. But what else is going on at this time? The White City, right? So you have the Chicago Fair, World's Fair. It was in Paris before with the Eiffel Tower. But in this case, we have in 1893, the first electricity, right? Edison brings it, lights it up. He also brings the electric chair, which has just been used. There's a lot of firsts. Well, you have the first of the zipper, the first time that you have Wrigley's gum or Pabst Blue Ribbon or Cracker Jacks. All those are first. The other thing that's interesting is the first of the Ferris wheel, right? So that's George Ferris who develops this and brings this. It's going to make, the gross is going to be $725,000, right? That's an enormous amount of money, and it's very successful. This image that you see was actually taken at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, and Geronimo is actually going to ride on that Ferris wheel. Now, the other person that's very interesting is this man, and this is going to be somebody that Dixon knows and talks to. He's really going to become the most famous person in the world. He sets up next to the World's Fair. Now, the fair says, sure, we'd love to have you. We'll take a little fee. We're not going to be open on Sunday. And he says, forget it. I can do it myself. And he does. He's going to make over $1 million, again, in a depression, if you can imagine that. Why this is important to Dixon is he's going to know this guy, right? He actually meets him in New York. This is a drawing that he does of Buffalo Bill. And Buffalo Bill's interesting. Buffalo Bill Cody, his first child, who was named after Kit Carson, who's going to die at age 7 from scarlet fever. But he also knew Custer. He was a scout for Custer, and his best friend from childhood was Wild Bill Hickok. So Dixon would have been able to talk to him about that, and Sitting Bull, who had been part of the fair, all those people, Dixon would have actually got firsthand account of what it was like in the Old West. And this is important for Dixon because he doesn't like the stuff that's not real. He wants to know what the real American West is. It's important to him. In 1895, Dixon's going to do his very first cover from Overland Monthly. Also going to be the first time he meets a very important man in his life, Charles Fletcher Lummis. I'm going to talk to you about him. But in this time frame where he's doing this cover, now it's only been 4 years since he talked to Remington and sent him his pictures at 16. Now at 20, they're calling him the next Frederick Remington. Now you can imagine that would be very positive in how you see and what you think you're going to do in life. And he meets Charles Lummis. So what we talk about. First of all, though, I want to say this is a poem that he did. And it's important because Dixon writes poetry his whole life. He starts about this time. And again, if you look at the signature, it's a unique, kind of different signature. He's still trying to figure it out. He hasn't got it quite yet, but he does include the Thunderbird emblem. And that's going to be used till about 1930. So he meets this guy, Charles Fletcher Lummis. He does this drawing in 1897. Lummis is unique. He's a very unique human being. He knows and went to school with Teddy Roosevelt at Harvard, and they're going to be friends and acquaintances for a good portion of their lives. In 1884, the LA Times called him and said, we'd like you to write some things for us. He's a paper writer. He's a journalist in Cincinnati, and he says, well, I'll do it better. I'm going to walk from Cincinnati to LA, and I'll give you weekly reports. And he does. He's going to walk 3,705 miles over 143 days. He leaves in September. And by the time he gets there, he's going to interview Frank James of the James Gang. He's going to break his arm. He's going to walk through huge snowstorms in New Mexico. And he's going to end up spending time in Isleta at the Pueblo in New Mexico. And by the time he actually arrives in Los Angeles, they make him the editor. So he gets immediate fame. And he likes this. Lummis enjoys this. And he's going to have lots of famous friends. And Dixon's going to be an important component to not only his friend role, but also to Dixon, because Dixon has the problem of a father figure not being in his life. And we'll talk about that. This is what Dixon does, right? He sends this image to him, Lummis, with his hat, right? He starts wearing Lummis's Stetson, his Texas Stetson, and he calls him Pop, and he refers to himself as kid, sometimes even father. And so one of the things that's going to happen in 1898 for Dixon, and why it's so important for Lummis to be a part of him, is in 1898, during the Spanish-American War, Dixon's father is going to die in a mental institution, right? And this really affects Dixon. His father is an interesting guy. He's an old Southern person who was in the Civil War, and I'm sure he had PTSD, and he moves to Fresno in 1868 and starts a law practice. Well, he dies young, and so what happens is Lummis fits in that place, and you'll see this back and forth relationship through Dixon in his writings. In the turn of the century, right around March, you have a pandemic. Most people don't even know about this. It was the bubonic plague that came to San Francisco. It had come in through Hawaii. And about March, they started having cases. This is a very serious disease. I mean, this was the Black Plague, right? So it's something that Dixon, I'm sure, was very well aware of because it's in the newspapers. He's writing for the newspapers. He's working for Hearst in 1899. So he skedaddles and goes to see Lummis down in LA, and he's going to sit under this tree at El Sol, that's Lummis's house, and this sycamore tree is very important in the relationship for Dixon. So he talks to Lummis and says, listen, I want to go east to see the West. And Lummis agrees. He says, I think that's very important for you to do. Under this tree, Dixon is going to get married. So on May the 5th of 1905, he'll marry Lillian West Toby. Lucille and Edward Breen will also get married underneath that tree in 1921. Lummis, when he dies on November 28th, 1928, is going to be laid underneath that. He's going to be wrapped in his finest Navajo blanket, covered with roses, red roses, and Dixon, along with Douglas Fairbanks and Borg and Breen, are all going to be pallbearers. So important guy for Dixon, no doubt. So Dixon goes, yeah, I'm going to go. I'm going to go to the east. And he's going to spend like 5 or 6 months going to Arizona and New Mexico. His first stop is with a man named Ben Spear. Ben Spear is an old trader, right? He has really been in this area for 35 years and has taken over the trading post, which was the old Mojave Fort of 1859. And he opens a trading post himself in the 1890s. And he said, sure, you can stay here. Feel free to be part of, my world and ask me questions. And he does. So Dixon's, again, really starting to absorb things. And what I love about this little drawing, it's called the Center of Creation at 122 in the shade. And Dixon says, you had to be a madman to be out there. People thought you were, because you only have farmers and ranchers and railroad people, and you have some kid out there drawing they just didn't understand. But Dixon captures the essence of what this was. This is what I like about him. If you look at those pots, they're Mojave pots. I can tell by the shape and the way he designs them. And Dixon is very careful about getting these little points right. I really feel like he's an ethnographer, that he actually is representing the West. But in reality, he says, no, that's not me. I do not do that. I'm an interpreter of the West. I see the image and I interpret it. But the reality is he's very careful about getting things right. And the Center of Creation on 122 in the shade shows that. He also goes to see cowboys that are, taking a break, reading their mail. And he goes to Indian Territory of Arizona Territory, AT. If you look at it, you can see where it says AT. Again, I put this in just to show that beautiful left to right hand 10 to 4 that he does in his drawing. You can see this is classic Dixon. He makes it all the way to Isleta. He actually was going to get to Santa Fe. I like this because, again, it shows Dixon what he is capturing, right? The guy's tying chili peppers. He's got a blanket off to his side, which is a Pueblo blanket, the right kind of blanket. And then if you look on the upper left, he's got a much more mature signature of Dixon, Isleta, and the Thunderbird. Now, he's going to run out of money, and he's going to call Lummis and says, I'm out of money. And by call, I mean they wire. And Lummis wires some money, and he actually comes and sees him in Isleta. He'll make it all the way to Santa Fe. He gets back, and the next year, he's feeling very depressed, actually. And Dixon writes Lummis and says, I'm unhappy, I'm sad, and it's girl trouble for him. And he doesn't really elaborate, but he's starting to have these components of depression. He already had one in 1899 when he said Hearst almost put him in a mental institution, and now this is 1901. So what does Dixon do? He and Barine go on a long trip, right? 1,000-mile horseback. They're going to leave May 6th with 6 horses, and they're going to head up through California and Nevada, the first time they go to Nevada, and they're going to go to Oregon, and their goal is to get to Montana. But the time they get to Idaho, the horses are broken down. They sell them, and they take a trip back on a train. So when he returns, what is he going to see? This. So September 6th of 1901, McKinley is shot, and he dies from gangrene 8 days later. And I'm sure this affected Dixon, as it all. I mean, when you see something that happens like that or hear about it, it really affects you. Like, what is America that our president, who got us out of the Great Recession, depression, is now shot? And that's the time frame, and that's what's going on in Dixon's life in 1901. I think it's important to understand these things that are happening in the world in the United States so you can understand what that artist, that person is feeling like when it's going on. So he's going to meet this guy the next year, Lorenzo Hubbell, in 1902. Very important guy. You can see he ran for United States Senator. He loses. But he gets to Ganado in 1878, and he's going to open a trading post, and he's going at Ganado, which he's going to call that, the Hubbell Trading Post we say now, and he'll open a bunch of other trading posts. He's again a father figure for Dixon, who's going to call him El Patron. They write back and forth in English and Spanish, as well as Dixon will write about problems that he has, things that are going on in his life. And he has a tendency to have this, and I think you have to realize Dixon is a very sensitive man. He's a creative person. He writes poetry. He's introverted in his own mind, but he tries to portray something different than that. This little drawing, it's pastel, is of the Hubbell Trading Post, which I just think is beautiful that Dixon did in 1902. He does this, Nahale, which is in the Danae up at her left. So Dixon again showing as an ethnographer, getting the correct title, which means, according to my Danae friends, is medicine man, and we think that might be Hostine Claw. And then 1903, Dixon gets the mumps, which is a serious disease when you're an adult. He's in his studio for about 3 months, holed up. And this comes out, Edison, right? Edison again. And this is a great train robbery. And it's the first time, it's the first Western, by the way, and the first time somebody's pointing directly at the camera. Well, Dixon thinks these things are hokey. He really does. He knows what the real West is. And seeing this kind of thing on the big screen portraying as this is what it was, he knows it's not true. So he doesn't like this. But what he does like is getting back to Arizona. And this is the true soul surely knows its own. That's what he put as on the bottom right. And then below that it says home again, right? And he circles it. I'm home. I'm back. And he portrays himself, again, as this thin, cachectic person. He's got the Texas Stetson on his hat, which is a Lummis hat. He's got Texas high-heel boots on that are all tooled. He's got his .45 caliber on. He's got a cigarette in his hand. And the interesting thing about this, also, if you look at the signatures, he's got the Dixon and the Thunderbird in 1903 in the bottom left. But what's interesting is how I got this. And it shows how art changes. Originally, I was doing a show in Los Angeles. It was an art show. I had a lot of Dixons. The show, when it was done, I was breaking things down. And this guy comes up to me who is part of the show workers. And he goes, I've got this Dixon drawing. It's kind of weird. Nobody really seems to want it or be interested in it. But I thought, you might be. And I said, let me see it. And he shows it. And I go, yeah, I'm definitely interested. Because I could see that there was an important story here, right? And just the home again really tells everything. And so what happens with this drawing that nobody wants, it ends up being in multiple museum shows, and it was even the frontis of a major Dixon retrospective. So art can change, interpretation can change, history is so important when you're trying to understand what these things are. So 1905, Dixon's going to go down to Mexico and then Guadalajara. And he's going to take a train. He's going to go on horses with Xavier Martinez, also a Bohemian fellow member. And Dixon's going to learn a lot about Spanish. Again, he'll be writing to Hubble all this time. He comes back and he gets married to his wife, Lillian West Toby. And again, that's on May 5th. Right after that, that's in May, he goes up to Tonopah and Goldfields to do an article for Cosmopolitan. And it's interesting because at that time in April, there was some kind of serious pneumatic disease that went through and killed like 30 young men. So I'm sure, again, Dixon was concerned going up in that area because he would have known about it. And they didn't even use that many of his drawings because photography was starting to really take place. So this is probably the most important inflection point, I think, in Dixon's life. Now, most people don't realize this, how important this date was. And look at this drawing. One of the things you'll see, Dixon looks like this very cool cucumber, right? He's got all his textiles and he's got one little satchel. That little suitcase has all those drawings like from where Breen and he were. And that's important because Dixon's going to use those for the rest of his life. He's got his hats perfectly on, little cigarette, and he's walking away very calmly. Now look in the back and you see all these people running and screaming, right? Buildings collapse. Well, imagine what happened on April 18th. This was done the day after by Dixon. But on April 18th at 5:12 in the morning, you have a 20-second foreshock followed by this very jarring 45 to 60 second 7.9 earthquake that screams through the San Francisco Bay Area. It's going to kill 3,000 people and destroy 80% of the town. So Dixon's going to be knocked out of his bed. He's going to start running for his studio because he knows all his stuff there. He can't afford not to have that. And on the way to the studio, right away, chimney falls and almost kills him. Now think about what he's seeing and thinking and feeling, right? A sensitive person. You have massive screaming and yelling, and buildings are still coming down. There's rubble everywhere. There's already smoke in the air. There's probably guns already going off and explosions happening, dogs barking. It would be complete pandemonium, and you've almost been killed. He gets to the studio, he runs up, and he grabs all his blankets. Now, he can see out the window that there's a massive storm of fire headed right to him. He can't get them all. One's too high. He can't get it. Another one is out to Miss Simpson. He can't get that. It's on approval. Those two are lost. And Dixon knows that he's going to own Hubble, because a lot of those are Hubble's pieces. So he has to get them. And he says, I could let my drawings, or my paintings specifically, my paintings go up in smoke. I can replace those, but I couldn't replace the others. I think he really values and cherishes those, but he also has a financial component in it. So Dixon does all this, right? And what does he say? He says, he says, those 3 horrific days I wouldn't have missed for anything. And I learned more in those than I would have in 10 years of living. So he has this bravado of, oh, I really gained something from that. Well, what's the realities? Well, I think the realities are this. This is a picture of Sam Day that Dixon drew, and it says, not for sale. That's in Dixon's hand. He's a very important guy to him. He has a Chinley trading post. And he writes to Sam Day, and he says, I had jaded facilities, and I'm not a faker, and what I'm telling you is the truth. He's saying, I've had problems. I'm having some emotional problems. And he goes, I would like to come and put my bedroll in front of your trading post for about 10 days. This is done in July, not long after the major earthquake. And then below he says, and I'll read it to you, how did you stand the recent Lummis visitation? Wow. Now, we don't know what that means. We don't have the back and forth, but I interpret it as maybe either Dixon talked to Lummis and gave him his true feelings of how he felt about this. And I'm sure he had PTSD from that point on, and they didn't treat that. And Lummis he wants out, and he goes up to see Sam Day, and Dixon has some anger to him, just like sometimes a son might have an anger toward a father. And Dixon felt this, this intensity with this man. He needed his approval at all times, and clearly at this time, 1906, he wasn't getting what he needed. 1907, Dixon does the murals for the Tucson Railroad. This is a little painting that he did at that time. He gets $500 for doing the murals, as well as some brochures and things for the railroad. And there's nothing happening in San Francisco, basically, because the city's in completely ruins. So he's going to go to New York, and it's the golden age of illustration, and he does. He heads to New York City at the end of 1907, right at basically January 1908. He sends his money ahead into the Lincoln Trust. Well, unfortunately, he only put 300 of the 500, but what happens is this, right? Rich man puts a bullet in his heart. They have a huge bank panic, and in New York City primarily. And it's going to be a great recession. It's going to cause it, and he loses the $300. Wall Street almost goes under. J.P. Morgan has to help bail it out. The city of New York almost goes insolvent. So I think from that point on, Dixon's going to have this great dislike and concern with institutions, especially banks. He shows up to New York, and this is basically what it would look like. This is called the Cliff Dwellers. This was done by George Bellows in 1913, and it's in the permanent collection of LACMA. And Dixon would have seen this because Lummis would have talked about this painting because he got paid a lot of money, and Dixon would have seen this. He also knew George Bellows anyway because they had the same building that they worked at with Robert Henry as well, 1947 Broadway. So they knew each other. And the reason this is important, because in New York in 1907, over 1 million immigrants come to the city that come through Ellis Island, and the most ever. And that would have been the atmosphere that Dixon shows up in this very hot, environment of lots of people and noise. And I don't think it was really great for him. He needs to have his solitude, like Nevada. So he does this kind of stuff, right? He's doing illustrations for Pearson's, Cosmopolitan, all those. He's super successful. 1909, he's going to see this September 29th. Orville Wright is going to go 2 times around the Statue of Liberty. Now, it made all the newspapers, and Dixon, of course, was very aware of newspapers, as well as he probably could have even seen this, right? And Dixon's thoughts at that point would have been like, oh my God, this is changing. Everything is changing. In fact, President Teddy Roosevelt's going to be the first president to ever ride in one of these a year later on October the 9th. So actually October the 11th. And when you think about that, Dixon's going, the West's changing. And Arizona on February the 14th of 1912 becomes a state. And Dixon leaves New York 1 month later. I think he thought, I've got to get out of here. And he writes to Lummis and says, I'm tired of lying about the West. I'm not going to do it anymore. And I think he really at that point kind of sheds himself of the Frederick Remington thought pattern and says, I need to get back to San Francisco. I want to be in the West and I want to do real things and fine art. And he does. He's going to meet this guy, Lucky Baldwin. He knows Lucky. He does this right before the earthquake in May of 1906. His daughter, Anita Baldwin, is very interesting. They're both interesting. I mean, Lucky Baldwin knows Wyatt Earp. Wyatt Earp gets married on his yacht. And Dixon would have, again, had these conversations. So he knows Wyatt Earp by one degree of separation. Anita Baldwin becomes his great mentor and patron, really more of a patron than a mentor, but she allows him to get all these social connections he wouldn't. And what he does is he does these murals for her in 1912. In fact, Dixon says from 1912, I am an artist, right? It was so important to him, these murals. These murals are featured in the San Francisco Chronicle. They're featured in the LA Times, big write-ups by the art directors and the art critics, and it's all positive. So Dixon now has a very important person who is going to help support him over time. She was going to pay him $8,000. She pays him $10,000. You can imagine how much money and how he must have felt at that time, like, I've made it. And he felt like he made it. He also does all the furniture. He does all the wallpaper. Don Haggerty and I go out in the late 1990s to see a Nokia before they destroy it. And I'm glad I did. I got a sense of what Dixon was doing and how he was working and the kind of things that he added to this whole project. The pool tables, which are those, are in our little Maynard Dixon Museum in Tucson. So in 1915, he starts a log, and he's going to keep this log for the next, he starts at 1915, and he keeps it until his death in 1946, 767 entries. Most of these are about 1620s and up, and not really commissions, but it's a lot of the majority of what he does, because he really understands, I've got to keep a log of who I am. I'm an important artist, and he is an important artist. In fact, he's going to be at the Pan Pacific show. This is a little billet that he did, and that's Dixon's drawing on that. And he's going to see some very interesting things there, right? He's going to enter 2 paintings. He's going to get a bronze medal for one of them. Edison's going to be there. He's going to get a medal as well. And what Dixon is going to discover is that all these impressionistic paintings are all there. Now, he clearly would have seen them in New York, but at that point, his paintings are there, and he sees the world a little differently. So he starts painting things a little heavier, impasto, as well as the color really changes more bright. And you can see this in like this painting, which is Dobie-town, right? This is what he calls Tempe in 1915. And from there, he's going to go to Arizona, out to the far part of the reservation, of the Apache Reservation, Western Apache Reservation. He's going to take a mail truck out there on a horse and wagon. He actually writes Hubble and says, is it okay to go? I'm bringing my daughter. She's 5 years old, Consti at that time. He says, yeah, no, it's fine. Just, be considerate and you'll be fine. And he does. So if you look at these 2 women, the thing I wanted to point out, the first woman, if you look at her basket, so there's long pieces of leather with little tinklers on it, right? And the basket's yellow too. You can't see it very well, but there's ochre color. And so she's young, and she still has all the accoutrements that would be on the basket. The back person is the older lady, and you can see she's older. And the basket, it doesn't have any of the tinklers. It doesn't have any of the leathers. And you can see her beautiful moccasins have the little tabs in the end. We call those cactus kickers. And so Dixon, again, is being an ethnographer. Now, again, he says, I don't represent the West. I interpret the West. But clearly, he is being an ethnographer to get the small details right. 1917, It's a great year and a horrible year for him at the same time. He gets divorced from Lillian, and she's a severe alcoholic. So he has a young daughter who's just about to turn 8, Consti. And he gets an invitation from Charlie Russell. He says, come up, you and Frank Hoffman come up, stay at Lake McDonald, and we'll get to know each other better. Dixon's already met him in New York, and he's going to become friends with Charlie Russell. And Dixon, again, really likes Charlie Russell. He thinks he's an important guy. He thinks he is one that represents the West, and he's fine with that. He's a real cowboy, and he was out there. He doesn't compare himself to Charlie Russell. He thinks he's a completely different type of artist, but he's going to enjoy going to, see the man who's obviously a critical, important Western artist, even at that time. And the Great Northern Railroad saying, great, you come up, we'll give you free passage, and we'll buy all your paintings. So Dixon says, great. And he's going to do 12 paintings for Great Northern. He's going to make $5,850. But what happens? Conscription happens. We enter World War I. Everything changes. Now the railroads say, we can't use your paintings in a railroad. We have to use bonds. The hotels are not going to have anybody in it. We can't buy them. Send them up next June and we'll see what we can do. And that's what he does. He sends them up and he sells like 5 of these over the time frame. We know at least 5 of these where they exist. We don't know where the other ones are. We don't know exactly what happened to them. And so Dixon comes home from this trip, right? He paints this piece for Joe Coppa for his restaurant. It's a beautiful piece called Lone Bull. But he's really depressed. And he's going to get and be in his studio for months, like 3 or 4 months, he's going to hold up. And he writes Lummis and he says, I'm done. I can't be an artist anymore. There's nothing left in me. And Lummis writes back, he goes, you're young, you're fine. Thomas Hill did it for much longer. You'll be fine. You just have to focus and do what you do. And also think about this in 1918. The pandemic flu is raging throughout the world. It's going to kill 50 million people, right? A huge amount of the world's population. And Dixon has bad lungs and he smokes. So I'm sure this is grinding on his mind. He has a divorce. He has a young child. His biggest $5,800 is evaporated, and he's distraught. But he pushes on, thank goodness, because we wouldn't have Pony Boy, Earth Knower, Men of Red Earth, none of these Shapes of Fear if he had stopped at that point. But he did continue, and he goes to where he likes to go for solitude, Nevada, right? So this is 1919. Now, if you read this, I found this quote in 1919 that Dixon wrote about Lummis, which I found fascinating. He says, I went to Lummis as a wounded man, and he rewarded me with coldness and indifference. I just walked out. Now, imagine, he probably went down to see him in Los Angeles, right, at El Asal, his home, and wanted to talk and wanted to be reassured that he's okay. And Lummis was busy or something was going on in his own life because he had a very amazing but crazy life of the things that he did, including starting the Southwest Art Museum in 1907. So Dixon's having a problem with Lummis in 1919. And again, he goes to see solitude. He seeks it out in Nevada, as he often does. He's luckily going to have met this person right at the end of 1919, Dorothea Lange, who's a very interesting and unique person. She's from Hoboken, New Jersey. She comes out to first LA and then to San Francisco. She too has problems. She has abandonment issues, big time. Her father walks out on her when they're like 12. And she also has polio, which she got at 7. And it affected her right leg. She had a deformity to it. And I'm sure that Dixon and Lange can relate to each other. I mean, Dixon has this severe problem of asthma. He was sickly most of his life, very cachectic, and he definitely has some abandonment issues with his father. So I think they bond over that, and it's very important they do. And they're going to get married in March 1920, the same year that they get the first right to vote for women. Natives don't get it till 1924. And Prohibition starts in 1920, which is going to go to 1933. Again, seeing the time frame of what happens is so important. I love this photograph of Dixon because it just kind of shows who he was, right? This is a beautiful photograph that Dorothea Lange took in 1925. Again, he's got his Stetson on. He probably had his cane with the little silver top on it, which is in your exhibit. 1922, he's going to head up to Kayenta. The Hollywood Bowl is getting ready to open. He goes to Kayenta, which is the most remote city in America. And why? Because he gets an invitation with John Weatherall, who owns a trading post up in that area. And he also starts to paint all these beautiful clouds. And this is a great example of one of those early cloud paintings. He's really starting to focus in on that period. The next year, he's going to go to Hopi, which is a great trip for him, and produces some of his most amazing paintings. And if you look at this one, Loma Hinma, he was a priest, a blind priest, who's going to help Dixon, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But how he gets there is Anita Baldwin contacts him and says, I want to do an American Indian opera, and I want to go to First Mesa and Hopi, and I want you to take me. I know you know all about it. So he and Dorothea Lange go to Los Angeles. They get on her private train with bulletproof windows, which will never come up. She sits in there with a little Derringer, little pearl-handled Derringer, and they're going to go out to Hopi land. When they get there, they're going to set up 10 pagoda tents, these huge tents that are going to have all these canned goods, including caviar. She's going to have her valets. She's going to have bodyguards, all these individuals. She tells Dorothea, you can be the cook. And so Dorothea does that, but she also takes great photos. And so for the next month, Dorothea and Anita Baldwin and Dixon are going to get to see Hopi land and spend time seeing the different dances, meet Nampeo, buy Nampeo pots, the great potter. And Dixon basically kind of wanders off right off the bat, and they go back in a month. He stays for another 5 months, again, staying with this man, Loma Hinma, who is, his brother's Namoki, who's also a priest. And it's interesting because they say that in the literature, Dixon had rheumatism, whatever that is. Don't know what that really means because I really don't know if he had rheumatism. But Namoki really works, and Loma Hinma especially, tried to heal Dixon with herbs and different things. And Dixon changes in his sensibility after this time. He becomes much more spiritual, I feel. And he's, a different person after he's going to leave Hopi. He does things like this, paints and draws things of the moment, women cutting meat. Again, he's really being an ethnographer. This is not going to sell, really. It's more for him. Carvers, Kachina carvers. He finishes there, and what does he do? His first book comes out on poetry and 7 drawings by Grabhorn Press. There's only 250 copies, each one with its own original cover. He has a child's book that he puts out at the same time. 1924, he's back in San Francisco, and there's a little, at the Sacramento State Library, he fills out a card. And it's interesting, again, very telling of Dixon. And in it, he says that I do interpretations of the West, right? That's my paintings. They're interpretation. He's very clear about this. And at the end, he says, the painting titles are superfluous, right? This is who I am, and this is what I do. And then if you look at the card itself, he has different things. He says painter, yes. He says sculptor, no. He says illustration, formerly, not true. He's still doing illustrations, right? And he will be doing them until 1942, the last one he does for the Oregon Trail. Teacher, no, not true. He teaches as well. And then he goes through all these lists, right? He goes, where did you study? Nowhere. No, not true. California School of Design, he did. He might not have been there very long, but he did. And who did you train with? Nobody. No, he did. Arthur Matthews, he trained with him. And what clubs do you belong to? None. Well, that's not true either. He belongs to the Salamagundi Club, he belongs to the Bohemian Club, and he belongs to a lot of other clubs. Dixon didn't, I think, want people to think he was a joiner or a part of clubs, but he really was. And then the final part was on this honor received. No, we know that's not true, right? He wins the bronze medal at Pan Pacific, and he wins a lot of other medals. In fact, he's going to win $400 for the survivors in 1924 at the Biltmore Salon. So Dixon, again, is trying to portray who he thinks he wants the world to see. And again, not uncommon, right? O'Keeffe dressed in a very special fashion. We wanted to know as O'Keeffe. Dixon does the same. He has the same kind of dress. He really wants to be seen as an artist. 1925, clouds have changed to a much modernist sensibility. This is Cloud World, one of his great paintings. 1928, he gets California's most expensive ever mural. They pay $9,500 for this. This is a pageant of tradition. He's going to work 4 months in the library. You can still see it, it's there. And he says, I loved it because I was part of the workers, and he really enjoyed that process. That same year, he's going to get the ability to get an invitation. He's going to paint this from LA to Phoenix and meet Chase MacArthur, who's the architect and builder of the Biltmore Hotel, who's a devotee of Frank Lloyd Wright. Dixon gets the commission, which is great. It's a big commission. You can still see it. It's there. This piece is 8 by 25 feet. If you go into the Biltmore Hotel, you go in, take a left. It's right there. They have all these different social events in there. Unfortunately, they never cover it, and it has like finger marks and little scrapes. Each time it seems a little worse. And this is called Legend of Earth and Sun. Again, an important thing. What happens? He's supposed to get 2 of these. October 24th, 1929, stock market crashes. And so does Dixon's career, as well as all other artists. They crash, right? In the next 4 years, he's going to sell only a couple of dozen paintings. And most of those will have to be discounted. Most of his money is now going to come from illustrations, right? And he does this. This is called Ghost People. He does this in 1930. It's going to be on the cover of a magazine. He doesn't like it. Something doesn't work. He destroys it. And he does this, Shapes of Fear, which does work and he does like. Very interesting painting. He says when he paints this, he goes, I felt like I had a vice around my neck. So when he does this, he enters it into the San Francisco Art Association's annual event. You have Glackens, Lucas, Hopper, Diego Rivera. All these individuals are competing, and Dixon wins the Harold L. Mack Award, which is the popular prize. And Dixon says about the judges, he goes, you would have to be an analyst to be able to be a judge in this. Now, he's referring to all the other people that are doing all these kind of modern art type things. Well, if you look at this painting, he truly needs the analyst as well. I mean, he clearly has a lot of emotional compact, and it's a drawing that's very effective, but it's obviously he has some issues. Now, he's going to enter that in 1932 in the 107th National Academy of Design in New York City, and he's going to win the Henry Ranger Award, which is $1,500. It's the best picture of the year. And Dixon's going to say about that money, it saved my life, which it did, right? And this is now in the Smithsonian. That drawing that you see is actually in our little museum. October 5th of 1930, Dixon's going to do all the drawings for the Golden Gate Bridge. It's going to be in this newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle, to get past a $35 million bond, which they're going to do in the Depression, which is pretty amazing. And they're only going to use $30 million to make it happen. But the interesting part of this is how it all occurred. So Dixon's brother-in-law, who's married to his sister Rebecca, works for Joseph Strauss, who's the head engineer of the Golden Gate Bridge. He needs a new architect. He asks his assistant, who should I get? Any recommendations? He said, Maynard Dixon. Maynard Dixon comes in. He says, sure, use Irving Morrow. He's young, but he'll do a great job. So Irving Morrow gets hired because of Maynard Dixon. Maynard Dixon gets to do all the drawings for the Golden Gate Bridge. So if you look at this letter, it's a critically important letter. It's written March 9th, 1935. The bridge is coming to a close. They're starting to get it finished. And Dixon writes Morrow, and he says, listen, I've already sent this to the newspapers, but you need to tell the Board of Supervisors that painting it gray or a dark color is definitely not going to work. You know, he goes, I know a thing about color. He goes, and you wanted an eye-fetching color. And you can't be the wonder of the world if you have it a dark color. You need to use the red undercolor that they have on the bridge, the red lead, and it will fade with time with nature. And if you need to, you can repaint it, but it will be harmonious and it will be the wonder of the world. And he goes, and I know a thing about painting. And then he says to the Board of Supervisors, he tells Morrow, he goes, you need to tell the bridge supervisors not to try to be smarter than God. So when you think of that bridge, you need to think about that red color and you need to think Maynard Dixon. So he goes to New Mexico. And again, there's not much money coming in, but Mabel Dodge Lujan says, come on, I'll give you a studio. Come on up to Taos. Dixon's always wanted to go to Taos. Blumenschein had invited him back in like 1912 to come to Taos and be part of the Taos founders in 1915, but he goes, I'm not that person. So he finally gets the opportunity. And he goes there, he leaves and gets there on July the 10th. He's going to stay till January the 15th of 1932, so 7 months. He's got all his children. He's got Dan, John, and Concy there. He paints this, Como se pasa la vida. It looks like an O'Keeffe in a lot of ways. And O'Keeffe was there, right? I don't know if he ever met O'Keeffe. He knew Stieglitz. He wasn't a fan of Stieglitz. We don't really know what he thought of O'Keeffe, but she was there. Paul Strand was there. And he paints some of his most intense, amazing paintings, like this piece, Earth Knower, which Clifford Still, the great abstract expressionist, writes about in his own biography, by his biographer, that it was a really important painting for him. And it is an important painting. It's a modernist sensibility. You have this Taos person who is grounded to the earth. And Dixon says the great art comes from native, sensibilities from the earth. And he's going to meet this man who's Juan Mirabal. And Mirabal's going to say, before he leaves Taos, he's going to say, if you need to come back, come stay with me. If it doesn't work there, I have a free house and you can stay. And Dixon says, I'm coming back for sure. I would be a fool not to come back. But he's never going to, because life changes, right? You're going to have all the things that are going to affect him, including the divorce coming up. So he sees this, the forgotten man, on his way back to California. And he's going to see all this exodus of people, and it's really going to affect Dorothea Lange. And when he gets back, he's going to take a trip in 1933 up through Nevada and to Utah. Again, 33, things are not great. He's not making sales. He really is feeling a sense of depression. His marriage is not going well. So he paints this, Abandoned Homestead. And now if you look at the bottom, I've included a thing there. I think you can see it. And it says, The Bank Wins. Now that was his first title. Didn't sell, right? So what does he do? He scratches it out, changes the title to Abandoned Homestead so he can try to get it sold. Here's the irony. I sold that to a banker. Full circle. Don't know what to say about that, but that's true. Dorothea's going to see this out her window. It's white angel bread line. It's really going to affect her. That's her first seriously important iconic imagery. And Dixon's going to follow suit with what he's trying to see as well. And Dorothea says in an interview that she did before her death that Dixon could have been so much more in her mind, and she should have pushed him more because of the social realism, which he does do for a period of time. Really from 1933 to 1939, he's really experimenting with this, and she thinks it's some of his greatest work, and you can't deny that it probably is. This particular piece, Road to Nowhere, the title alone tells you this is probably his first Depression-era piece, which is in your show. And this was done when he goes to do a PWA commission for the government, where he's going to be paid $350, right? He says it's worth $3,000 worth of money. So he's getting 10 cents on the dollar. But he also does things like this, where he's out in the field looking and absorbing what's going on, right? This is such an interesting paper. It was in the newspaper, and Dixon sent it to really try to ruffle some feathers. And I think he was really surprised they put it in, but they spun it a little differently in the newspaper, right? So what Dixon shows is the senator, the fat cat up there, right? He's got somebody next to him who's taking photos with a binocular, well-dressed people, a woman in a dress, two lovers in the background who are really more interested in, doing their thing. And Dixon wants them to see this image. And what the newspaper writes is this: these pictures by Maynard Dixon, PWA artist, shows the sightseers are almost as busy. Well, this is what Dixon sees, right? Men are tired. And it sums up everything that Dixon feels about what's going on. And you have to realize Dixon's own brother-in-law, Dorothea's brother Martin, who's an erudite, is working at a manual labor job. And during this time that he's there for 5 weeks, from April to the first part of May, there's 4 people that die while he's there, and the hospitals are completely full. And Dixon says he lived with these men, and he said, I never could get to the heart of the people, right? What he was observing and seeing, and he didn't like really what he saw. And he really, I think, felt like, and he says that really the land is going to have, the mountain's going to have the last laugh in this. He thinks this is going to ultimately not work. And We'll see what happens with all the water loss that keeps going on. Maybe he's right. I don't know. But if you look at the titles, this is catwalk, right? And it shows this little individual that's on the catwalk, as well as these men in the turbines, just little teeny. They're insignificant, right? Men against rock, right? Again, the title tells you everything that you need to know about this. What happens October 9th of 1936? Well, Los Angeles explodes with lights, right? 1 million people are going to show up at Broadway. They're going to have big parties, lots of parades, because we've got the lights. Well, what happens when Dixon gets back in 1934? He sees this, right? You have the longshoremen's strike that's going up and down the coast. And on July 5th and Bloody Thursday, you're going to have 2 people killed. You're going to have thousands upon thousands of people are going to be marching on Market Street. So completely, utterly chaotic time frame in San Francisco at that time. And you're in the Great Depression. Now, the interesting thing about this little drawing, if you look, you can see the lines that go through around this painting, and he's using a symmetry, a dynamic symmetry, but it's modified. So J. Hambidge, who is an individual who comes up with dynamic symmetry, is influencing Dixon, as well as, I think, and here's the bigger drawing of this, this is the one that's in the museum in Oakland, is this, right? George Bellows, right? So this is Stagg at Sharkey's, done in 1909. Dixon would have seen this. It would have either even seen it in Bellows' studio, which he, was in the same building he was, the Lincoln Arcade building in 1947 Broadway, or he might have seen it at one of the few exhibits that went around town. But he would have been aware of it. And if you look at this, the way the setup is, and by the way, Bellows is going to be very involved with Hambidge dynamic symmetry after he hears him in a lecture in 1917. So he's already trying to set this up, Bellows, and I think Dixon has an impression and is taking from Bellows. If you again look back at the pickets, you can see, and then you go to Stagg at Starkey's, you can see something there, right? At least I can, including the color combination. Just as a little side note, Bellows, who dies in 1925 from a ruptured appendix, will also, one of Dixon's early idols, Frederick Remington, dies from an appendectomy in 1909. Who knows? Circuitous, right? This is Dorothea's most famous piece, Florence Owen Thompson. It's The Migrant Mother, which she takes in she's a pea picker in 1936. They're basically starving. And this photo really captures the world and captures the people to, we need to help migrants. This is done in 36. She takes this, and 35, she's going to have a dissolved marriage with Maynard Dixon. She's going to end up marrying Paul Taylor, who's an economics professor at Berkeley, much more stable. She needs that, right? She doesn't want to be Miss Maynard Dixon, which is what they refer to her as when they interviewed Dixon, Dorothea, coming back from Taos. She wants to be her own person, and she can't do it with Dixon. Dixon goes out for months and months at a time on these long trips, and she doesn't know when he's going to come back. She has the children, and she is a creative person who is ambitious. So Dixon goes and gets a divorce in, again, coming to Nevada, right? Solitude, just as your show says. And it's interesting, this painting, right? I see this painting, and I saw it 20 years ago, and I know the title, right? Lonesome Hills in Nevada, but I don't put it together, right? I haven't been in the saddle long enough to understand what this means. At that time, I just associate it with strictly literal, the Lonesome Hills of Nevada. Not true. Dixon is the Lonesome Hills of Nevada. That painting implements who he feels right there. And he's suffering. He really is. He's writing a lot of poetry that's very dark and touches him, because even though he knows this marriage shouldn't work and it's over, he can't help himself because he loves her. He respects her. I'm sure of that. Luckily for Dixon, he meets Edith Hamlin, who's this wonderful artist. Everybody says she's wonderful. John Dixon, who I knew well, said, she was really a perfect lady. She was really a gem. And they get married in Carson City in September, I believe, is when they got married, 1937, under a tree like this. And what's going on in Dixon's life? Well, in June 5th of 1937, Harold Clark contacts him. He's the business dean at BYU and says, I saw your paintings in the St. Louis Dispatch of, these Depression eras, and they're great. I want to figure out a way that BYU can own them. So he does. He sells 85 paintings and drawings and sketches to them for $3,700 in 1937. Now, there's a couple reasons Dixon does this. One is I think he really wants them in an institution. I think that's important to him. Two, he doesn't want somebody like Hearst to end up with him, and he's afraid somebody like that's going to end up with all his paintings. And the money will come in great handy because it's still, the Depression's still going on. There's still problems going on. He doesn't have a lot of money. And he probably knows that something's going to happen with Edith and he's going to marry her because this is done right before they get married. So he wants the security of the money, right? A little side note is this particular piece was in Stendhal Galleries. And in 1939, you could pay 55 cents and you could go see Guernica, right? In August, it was up there. If you went around the corner in Stendhal's, you could also see Maynard Dixon because he was hanging there as well. This is a note that Dixon writes to Irving Morrow, right? He's getting ready to leave. So Dixon has a big studio sale, right? It's going to be October 12th, 13th, and 14th. It lasts 3 weeks because there's so many people interested in it. But Dixon writes to Morrow, and he goes like this. He writes in the bottom, this is Dixon's hand, "Well, this is it, hoping you're not the same." And he underlines not, Maynard Dixon. Well, what is that? He knows he's got problems, health problems. He can't stay in San Francisco. The weather's not good. He needs a more drier, area. He's got COPD by this point in time. So he draws this little drawing as he leaves and takes off out of San Francisco again, right? Saying his goodbyes. Again, very hectic looking. He's got still has his Lummis hat on and his cowboy boots. And where does he go? Well, he and Edith go on one more trip in 1939, and they go to capture the migration and the people that are in Southern California, right? And it really affects Dixon. He sees this and he's really moved by all the, pain and trauma that's going on. And he does some amazing pieces, right? And John Steinbeck, in April 14th of 1939, is releasing Grapes of Wrath, which is going to win American Booker Prize, it's going to win the Pulitzer, and it'll be associated with the Nobel Prize, which he'll receive. And the papers write to Dixon, and they interview him not long after Steinbeck's book comes out, and he goes, "Mr. Dixon, are you going to be the next Steinbeck artist?" And Dixon's equivocal on this. He says, "I don't know. I hope I can. I don't know if it'll come out." So I think Dixon is really still hearing Dorothea's voice in his head that I need to be this person. It's important. I see it. I don't like it. But the reality is he has a different life, a different path, right? He's moving away from there. He's going to go to Arizona and Utah with Edith Hamlin. And that is going to be his path. So right away, he goes and starts doing this, right? This is Tucson. It's cactus. There's a painting on there. He's going to go to Utah, have a cabin there where he can go in the summers when it's not hot. So it's a place that you can go. It's a museum, right? And it's a wonderful time. If you can go see it, I encourage it. It's up in Mount Carmel. But Dixon's aware of what else is going on, right? World War II is raging, and he's on top of it. And you can see this is the New Order in 1940. He does this 42, 43. And you can see how Dixon's envisioning this, right? And he sees this world changing, right, in front of him. He also sees his old world changing in front of him, right? These are called the Frontier Pants series, right? He does a lot of them, and they're very successful. But he sees the old real cowboy that's now working as a dude ranch, and his job has completely changed. Everything has changed. Dixon sees automobiles, planes, the movies, everything has changed, and he probably feels like, am I a dinosaur? I don't know, but he probably felt that way. He paints this, which is Choice Against Mountains, something like behind me. And if you wonder why I'm interested in Dixon, you might just see, this is what I see out my window. So, he contacts and gets me, I get him very much by just every day I look out and I see a Dixon panorama. He makes his last trip, really significant trip to Utah in 1944. He's going to try to go back up in 45, but he can't handle it. It's just not going to work. So he paints this. He's now, by the time 45 comes up, right, he is on oxygen full time. He sees this on August 6th, of Hiroshima. And, the nuclear age is upon us, right? Starts in the Gilded Age, now he's in the nuclear age. And I'm sure it affected him. It would. I mean, you have to think, what's our world coming to? But yet, what he does, he sits out his window. This is done in August 1945, same time as that nuclear explosion happened, probably afterwards. And he's looking out at the Catalina Mountains. He's looking at the clouds, right? He's not going to sell this. Has no monetary value, really. But the clouds are still calling him, right? And I'm sure Dixon at this point in time was thinking, I had a good life, and it was a successful life. And the thing that was so successful for Dixon really was he felt like he was able to make a living his entire life as an artist. And he was very proud of that. And he portrayed the American West.